Inside Folsom State Prison, California, Johnny Cash wasn't lying. There are prisons that punish the body, and prisons that break the spirit. Folsom State Prison has done both for more than a century. Men entered these walls believing they could survive anything. Many were wrong. Because long before Johnny Cash sang about Folsom, this place already had a reputation, one built on violence, silence, and a system designed to remind you, every single day, that freedom is gone. And what happens inside these walls is far darker than the song ever told. Born from stone and blood, Folsom State Prison was never meant to be humane. It was meant to be permanent. Construction began in the late 1800s, using granite quarried by inmates themselves. Every block of stone was cut, lifted, and set by men already condemned by the system. From the beginning, punishment wasn't just confinement, it was labor, exhaustion, and obedience. The prison opened officially in 1880, making it one of the oldest prisons in California. Its location wasn't chosen by accident. Isolated, surrounded by harsh terrain, and deliberately distant from population centers, Folsom was designed to disappear people from society. Early inmates didn't sleep in cells as we imagine them today. They slept in cages. Literal cages. Stacked, narrow, iron-barred compartments where men could barely stand upright. Privacy didn't exist. Silence wasn't optional. And weakness was noticed immediately. What's important to understand is this: Folsom wasn't chaotic in its early years. It was controlled. Brutally controlled. And that control came with rules, rules that, if broken, carried consequences far worse than isolation. But those consequences evolved over time, and what came next would define Folsom's legacy forever. Daily life inside Folsom. To survive Folsom, you had to learn its rhythm. Every day began early. Long before sunrise. The sound of metal doors unlocking echoed through the cell blocks like a warning bell. Breakfast was quick, functional, and silent. No one lingered. No one complained. Talking too much could get you labeled. Looking at the wrong person for too long could start a fight. And fighting was rarely just between two men. In Folsom, inmates learned fast that power didn't come from strength alone. It came from alliances. Race-based groupings emerged early, not as ideology, but as survival. Protection was currency. Loyalty was life insurance. Correctional officers maintained order from elevated gun rails, armed positions that overlooked the yard. The message was clear: violence would be met with violence. Yet despite the rigid structure, Folsom was never calm. Tension lived in the air. Every interaction carried weight. A dropped tray. A missed signal. A rumor spreading through whispers. Men learned to read body language better than words. And beneath all of this, punishments waited. Some were official. Others were not. And what happened when inmates broke the rules, spoken or unspoken, was something most never forgot. Discipline and fear. Punishment inside Folsom wasn't designed to correct behavior. It was designed to break resistance. Solitary confinement, known simply as the hole, was one of the most feared places in the prison. Cold. Silent. Deprived of natural light. Inmates placed inside could spend days, weeks, sometimes longer with nothing but their thoughts. Meals were minimal. Communication was non-existent. Time lost meaning. Some men came out quieter. Some came out angrier. Others never came out the same at all. But solitary was only one layer of discipline. There were work punishments. Loss of privileges. Targeted searches. And sometimes, unofficial consequences, delivered by other inmates, not guards. Because in Folsom, authority wasn't held by one group alone. And that balance of power, between inmates, guards, and the system itself, created an environment where violence wasn't an exception. It was a language. And soon, that language would explode in ways no one could ignore. Riots, blood, and loss of control. Folsom has seen riots. Many of them. Some started over food. Others over racial tensions. Some over rumors that spread faster than officials could contain. When violence broke out, it spread fast. Yard fights turned into block-wide chaos. Homemade weapons, crafted from metal scraps, toothbrushes, and sharpened tools, appeared in seconds. During major disturbances, guards retreated to secure positions. Control was regained not through negotiation, but force. Lives were lost. Careers ended. Policies changed. But here's the part most people don't realize. Riots didn't make Folsom worse. They revealed what was already there. Because long before the world paid attention, Folsom was already a pressure cooker. And then, one man walked in with a guitar and a voice that would make the world listen. Johnny Cash enters Folsom. When Johnny Cash performed at Folsom State Prison in 1968, it wasn't a publicity stunt. It was personal. Cash had long been drawn to prisons, not as symbols of rebellion, but as places where society hid its failures. He didn't romanticize the inmates. He acknowledged them. The performance was raw. Unpolished. Honest. When he sang, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die," the reaction wasn't outrage, it was recognition. Not because the inmates admired violence, but because the song spoke without pretending. For a brief moment, Folsom wasn't invisible anymore. But while the concert ended, the prison didn't change overnight. The gates closed. The routines resumed. And the survival rules stayed exactly the same. Because Folsom didn't care who sang inside its walls. It cared who could endure them. And endurance came at a cost few outsiders ever understood. The unwritten rules of survival. Every prison has rules that aren't written down. Folsom's rules were unforgiving. Don't ask questions. Don't interfere. Don't owe anything you can't repay. Respect was everything, and it was earned through consistency, not words. New arrivals were tested. Not always violently, but psychologically. How you walked. Where you sat. Who you spoke to. Mistakes were remembered. Protection came at a price. Refusing affiliation made you vulnerable. Choosing the wrong one could be worse. Guards knew these dynamics existed. Some ignored them. Some exploited them. And some tried to disrupt them, with limited success. Because Folsom wasn't just a prison. It was a society. And like any society built on fear, it adapted faster than anyone expected. But as decades passed, something began to change. Not the violence. Not the tension. But the way the world looked at places like Folsom. And that shift would bring consequences no one inside could escape. Legacy, myth, and the truth. Today, Folsom State Prison still stands. Older. Reinforced. Watched more closely than ever before. Some things are safer. Some systems are stricter. But the core reality remains. Folsom was never just a prison. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when punishment replaces rehabilitation. When silence replaces accountability. When society forgets the people it locks away. Johnny Cash didn't lie. But he didn't tell the whole story either. Because the real story of Folsom isn't found in lyrics or headlines. It's found in the men who learned how to survive inside its walls. And the ones who didn't. Folsom State Prison doesn't need exaggeration. Its history speaks for itself. A place built from stone, sustained by fear, and remembered through scars most people will never see. And the truth is this. Long after the music faded. Long after the riots were suppressed. Folsom remained exactly what it was always meant to be. A place where freedom ends. And survival begins. When the lights go out. Night inside Folsom was never quiet. When the final count was called and cell doors slammed shut, the prison didn't go to sleep, it changed shape. Voices dropped to whispers. Sounds carried farther. Every cough, every footstep, every distant shout echoed through the stone like a reminder that no one was ever truly alone. For some inmates, night was the safest time. For others, it was the most dangerous. Cells offered little protection. Bars didn't stop threats, they only delayed them. Messages were passed through plumbing pipes, through hand signals, through looks exchanged earlier in the day. Plans were made hours before anyone acted. This was when debts were collected. When grudges resurfaced. When decisions became irreversible. Correctional officers walked tiers on strict schedules, flashlights sweeping across faces. An inmate who looked too alert raised suspicion. One who looked too calm raised even more. And then there were the screams. Not every scream meant violence. Sometimes it meant mental collapse. Sometimes it meant withdrawal. Sometimes it meant a man realizing that the sentence in his head was heavier than the one on paper. What's chilling is how quickly the sound faded into routine. Men learned to roll over. To stare at the ceiling. To wait for morning like it was a mercy. But for some, morning never came the same way again. Mental survival in a place designed to erase you. Folsom didn't just test physical endurance. It attacked the mind. Long sentences blurred into decades. Appeals were denied. Letters stopped arriving. Family visits became memories instead of events. Some inmates coped by building routines within routines. Push-ups at the same hour every day. Reading the same books repeatedly. Memorizing lyrics, poetry, entire conversations. Others turned inward. Depression inside Folsom wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Men stopped showering. Stopped eating. Stopped reacting. Guards noticed, but noticing didn't always lead to intervention. There was an unspoken understanding inside the walls: if a man lost control of his mind, the prison would not slow down for him. And yet, even here, identity mattered. A man who showed fear became a target. A man who showed emotion was tested. A man who showed nothing at all was watched. So most learned to perform strength, even when they didn't feel it. And the ones who failed to perform, often disappeared into the background of the institution. But Folsom had another side few outsiders ever saw. Moments of humanity that felt almost out of place. Fragments of humanity. Despite everything, Folsom was not completely devoid of humanity. Religious services brought temporary calm. Music echoed differently inside stone walls. For an hour, men sat shoulder to shoulder without hostility. Some prayed. Some slept. Some just listened. Educational programs came and went depending on funding, politics, and public opinion. A man who learned to read inside Folsom often described it as survival, not self-improvement. Work assignments provided rare structure. Kitchens. Maintenance crews. Laundry. Jobs that offered movement and, occasionally, respect. These moments mattered more than they seemed. Because in a place designed to strip identity, any reminder of being human carried weight. But even these fragile systems were vulnerable. One incident. One fight. One lockdown. And everything stopped. Which brings us to the moments when Folsom reminded everyone, inside and outside, that control was always temporary. Lockdown. Lockdown at Folsom was absolute. No warning. No explanation. Just alarms, shouted orders, and doors slamming shut. Inmates dropped where they stood. Hands visible. Eyes forward. Any hesitation was interpreted as resistance. Cells became cages again. Meals were delivered cold. Showers were cancelled. Programs suspended. Days blended together. Lockdowns could last hours, or weeks. Rumors filled the silence. Someone stabbed. Someone killed. Something smuggled in. Something lost control. What mattered wasn't always what happened, it was how the prison responded. Lockdown reminded everyone who held the final authority. And yet, every lockdown also reinforced a truth that haunted Folsom's history: no matter how strict the system became, it was always reacting, never preventing. Because violence didn't come from chaos alone. It came from pressure. And Folsom was built to apply it endlessly. Time doesn't heal in here. Years inside Folsom didn't soften men. They sharpened them, or wore them down completely. Lifers learned to think in decades. Parole hearings became rituals rather than hopes. A denied parole wasn't shocking. It was expected. Younger inmates watched older ones carefully. They saw the future waiting for them. The ones who adapted. The ones who broke. The ones who simply existed. Age didn't grant safety. It only changed the nature of risk. An older inmate might avoid fights, but that didn't mean he was safe. Vulnerability shifted, but it never disappeared. And for those who eventually left Folsom, freedom came with its own punishment. The outside world moved faster. Louder. Less forgiving than they remembered. Many returned, not because they wanted to, but because Folsom had taught them how to survive only one way. This was the cycle no song ever captured. The myth versus the reality. To the outside world, Folsom became a symbol. A name. A reference point. To those who lived inside it, Folsom was specific. Personal. Relentless. It smelled a certain way. Sounded a certain way. Felt a certain way when the doors closed behind you for the first time. Johnny Cash gave Folsom a voice, but the prison never needed one. Its legacy was already written into its walls. Every reform debate. Every protest. Every headline about incarceration. Folsom stood as evidence of what happens when punishment becomes identity. And the uncomfortable truth is this: places like Folsom didn't fail by accident. They succeeded exactly as designed. What Folsom leaves behind. Today, Folsom continues to operate. Modified. Observed. Studied. But history doesn't disappear just because procedures change. The stories remain, in disciplinary records, in scars, in memories carried by men who survived its systems. Some remember Folsom as hell. Some as home. Some as a place that took everything, and some as a place that forced them to confront who they were. All of them agree on one thing. Folsom never let you forget where you were. Folsom State Prison isn't just a chapter in criminal justice history. It's a mirror. A reflection of fear, control, and what society chooses to do with the people it condemns. Johnny Cash wasn't lying. But the truth runs deeper than any lyric. Because long after the song ends, long after the gates close, Folsom keeps asking the same question it always has. Not whether a man can survive prison, but what survives prison inside the man. The men who defined Folsom. Every prison is shaped by the men who passed through it. Folsom was shaped by the ones who stayed. Some inmates arrived already notorious, bank robbers, repeat violent offenders, men whose names carried weight before they ever stepped inside. Others became known only after years within the walls, through fights survived, alliances formed, or simply by lasting longer than anyone expected. Reputation mattered here. It traveled faster than paperwork. A man known for retaliation was rarely tested twice. A man known for weakness was rarely left alone. And a man who kept his word whether feared or respected, had something close to security. Guards knew these reputations too. Officially, everyone was treated the same. Unofficially, officers understood who needed watching, who needed separating, and who was already holding the block together through quiet authority. Some inmates became mediators. Others became enforcers. Not appointed, accepted. This invisible hierarchy didn't replace the prison system. It ran alongside it. Sometimes beneath it. Sometimes directly against it. And when those two systems collided, the consequences were immediate. When power shifts. Power inside Folsom was never static. Transfers changed the balance. New arrivals brought outside conflicts with them. One removed figure could create a vacuum, and vacuums were dangerous. Suddenly, rules were questioned. Boundaries tested. Old tensions resurfaced. These were the moments when violence spiked, not out of chaos, but out of recalculation. Men watching closely. Waiting to see who would step forward, and who would fall back. Correctional officers anticipated these shifts. Extra counts. Heightened searches. Restricted movement. But prisons don't control intention. They only respond to action. And in Folsom, action often came without warning. A single fight could ripple through an entire housing unit. One incident could justify weeks of lockdown. One decision, made in seconds, could change a man's life permanently. This was the environment Johnny Cash walked into briefly. And walked out of safely. Most never did. Parole, hope and humiliation. Parole at Folsom wasn't freedom. It was judgment. Inmates prepared for hearings for years. Some rehearsed answers endlessly. Others stopped trying altogether, convinced the outcome was already decided. Panels asked about remorse, growth, responsibility. The same questions. The same measured responses. And then came the decision. Denied. Often without explanation that felt meaningful. Sometimes with language so detached it felt rehearsed. A denial didn't just delay release. It reshaped identity. It reminded inmates that their future existed entirely in someone else's hands. Some men returned to their cells quieter than before. Others returned furious. A few broke completely. Parole wasn't just a system. It was psychological warfare. And for those denied repeatedly, Folsom stopped being a sentence. It became a lifetime. The longest sentences. Life sentences inside Folsom weren't dramatic. They were slow. Years marked by routine rather than events. Birthdays unacknowledged. Family members aging through photographs. Parents dying through letters. Lifers developed strategies outsiders rarely understood. Some stopped counting time altogether. Some measured life in routines instead of years. Some mentored younger inmates, not out of kindness, but because structure kept them sane. Others rejected connection entirely. Emotional detachment became armor. Folsom didn't force despair. It allowed it. And for many, that was worse. Knowledge as contraband. Information inside Folsom carried power. Legal books were prized. A man who understood case law became valuable. A jailhouse lawyer could change another inmate's future, or at least give him hope. Education programs, when available, altered trajectories quietly. A GED earned inside Folsom didn't erase a sentence, but it changed how a man carried it. Still, progress was fragile. Funding cuts ended programs overnight. Lockdowns erased months of progress in days. And every improvement existed under one condition. It could be taken away at any time. That uncertainty shaped everything. Folsom and the outside world. Public opinion shaped Folsom more than inmates ever could. Political shifts brought tougher policies or brief reform efforts. Headlines after violent incidents hardened attitudes. Quiet years brought neglect. Very few decisions were made with inmates in the room. And yet, every decision landed on them. Longer sentences. Fewer programs. Stricter classifications. Folsom absorbed it all, unchanged in spirit, reshaped only in procedure. Because the prison didn't exist to evolve. It existed to contain. What survival really means. Surviving Folsom didn't always mean staying alive. It meant holding on to identity. Memory. A sense of self not entirely defined by a number or a charge. Some men succeeded. Others adapted so completely that the outside world became foreign. Freedom frightened them more than confinement ever did. This was the cost no sentence described. Folsom State Prison doesn't shout its brutality. It whispers it, day after day, year after year. In routines. In silence. In the way time stretches and compresses behind stone walls. Johnny Cash told the world about Folsom. But the prison told its inmates something else entirely. That survival isn't heroic. That endurance isn't noble. That punishment, when prolonged enough, becomes identity. And long after a man leaves Folsom, if he ever does, some part of the prison leaves with him. That is Folsom's true legacy. If Folsom State Prison teaches us anything, it's that punishment doesn't end at the gate, it lingers long after the doors close. History remembers the music, the riots, the headlines. But the real story lives in the silence between them. Because behind every wall is a system. And inside that system, are human beings. Until next time.